third day. That's been very informative and a lot to process for sure. And I think our last session of the day on the cultures of Erasure will be very valuable in providing a macro level discussion on Chamber 3 on specifically the politics of Palestine exception and Zionist culture and genocidal denial. And we have two great panelists that will be providing this overview in these discussions. First, we have Osama Makdisi, professor of history at UC Berkeley, and is most recently the author of The Age of Coexistence and the Ecumenical Frame and the Making of the Modern Arab World. And we are also joined by his brother, Seri Makdisi, who is a professor of English and Comparative Literature at the University of California, Los Angeles. And these are 2/3 of the Makdisi brothers. We are only missing Karim, and I encourage you also to follow their podcast, Makdisi Street, which is also very informative and useful in this context. So I will pass it over to Osama first to discuss the politics of Palestine exception. Osama, the floor is yours.
Me? Okay. Thank you for the opportunity to address the Gaza Tribunal, and a special thank you to Professor Richard Falk, of course, to the steering committee members, to Wissam Ahmad, and to the Chamber 3 co-chairs, Jamil Aydin and Penny Green, whose patience I've taxed and whose work, of course, has been invaluable in making today happen. The question I'd like to address with you today is the historical and ideological underpinnings of what we call the Palestine exception. This exception has allowed so much of what we've already discussed and heard today to happen. How, in other words, Western governments, officials, mainstream journalists deny and yet paradoxically condone and enable the genocide in Gaza. The Palestine exception works by constantly evoking a very specific and profoundly Eurocentric narrative of anti-Semitism. This narrative displaces Palestinians from history at the same time as Israel displaces Palestinians from their own land. Ideologically, the Palestine exception expels Palestinians from serious ethical or political consideration in the name of reconstituting and defending Western humanity and so-called civilization after the Second World War. The Palestine exception has forced upon the Palestinians the burden of not simply being the victims of the victims, to evoke Edward Said's famous formulation, but the stigma of being a reincarnation of Nazis after Nazism in post-Holocaust Western consciousness, allegedly and putatively cleared of its historic anti-Semitism, to say nothing of an Israeli Jewish consciousness that has predicated its entire colonial project in Palestine on the denial and destruction of Palestinian history, Palestinian memory, and Palestinian archives. Why, in short, across so many parts of the liberal West that so solemnly proclaims the universality of law and enshrines notions of human rights, are Jewish victims of violence valued vastly more than the greater number of Palestinian victims? Most of all, why does the alleged Western concern with combating Western anti-Semitism coincide so clearly with an apparent mainstream Western lack of concern for and disavowal of Palestinian humanity? The question that concerns me, to be clear, is how and why Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims more generally are rendered peoples without history, peoples without ethical or political importance, peoples whose past and therefore whose present and future can be overwritten by a deeply Eurocentric philo-Zionist narrative. This overriding is one that has valorized for a century, at least, the imperatives of nationalist Zionist ideology in Palestine, that has cherished and celebrated the creation of an exclusively Jewish nationalist state in a multi-religious Palestine, irrespective of the obvious implications such a state has entailed for millions of non-Jewish men, women, and children, in other words, Palestinians, as well as, of course, for Jews themselves. Now, the interesting aspect of this overwriting of Palestinian history, this erasure of Palestinian history, has been the profoundly uneven manner of its transaction over a century and a bit. At first, in the 19th century, if we go back to the 19th century, Palestinians as people were barely seen or considered. Then, with the advent of British-backed colonial Zionism in Palestine, and specifically with the Balfour Declaration of 1917 and then the British Mandate that lasted until 1948, Palestinians were considered, quote, non-Jewish natives, who were very much seen, and because, of course, they were on the ground, to the point where the UN 1947 partition plan openly acknowledged the degree to which partition would harm the Arabs of Palestine. Then, of course, you had the Nakba. Palestinians were forgotten by the liberal West. And finally, when Palestinians have insisted on their history and their future, as well as on their present, they have almost always been demonized as anti-Semitic after the Nakba. So the Zionist project in and over Palestine developed as an openly colonialist project in the 19th century, when European empires routinely segregated humanity into a hierarchy of superior and inferior races. So while leading Zionists grappled with racial anti-Semitism in Europe, they were also desperate to belong to this Europe. They expressed, they shared, they contributed, they circulated many of the foundational racist tropes of 19th century Western culture. That the non-West was manifestly inferior, supposedly, that the lands of indigenous peoples was largely empty and thus open to colonization, that removal of native peoples was both justifiable and necessary. Recall, of course, one of the notorious slogans of the Zionist movement, a land without a people, for a people without a land. And the underlying point here is that both the Christian and Jewish versions of colonial Zionism were predicated on solving Europe's Jewish question, quote unquote, by removing or restoring Jews en masse to Palestine as if Palestinians did not exist or fundamentally did not matter. Now, this obfuscation was theoretical as long as Zionism remained ideology in Europe. But once it became colonial practice in Palestine, it became, of course, colonial practice. As soon as Zionism, in other words, moved from Christian and Jewish Western colonial fantasy to Western colonial practice, Muslim and Christian Palestinians inevitably were seen. They were, of course, on their homes, in their lands, in Palestine. As such, they constituted a real impediment to the successful unfolding of colonial Zionism. Native resistance, that is to say, Palestinian resistance, compelled the British colonial rulers to figure out some way to reconcile their commitment to Zionism in Palestine, colonial Zionism, with the reality of Palestinian bodies on the ground. And so, in other words, how do you resolve this sort of impossible situation? The British in 1937 proposed the partition plan of Palestine, which foreshadowed, that's the Peel Commission plan, which foreshadowed the 1947 UN partition plan. Both plans, the British one and then the UN one, a decade apart, prioritized making of a Jewish state, not the creation of a secular and democratic state. Both embraced as a central idea that the dispossessing of native Palestinians, the majority of the population, from much of its land and its homes, to make way for a Jewish state was both necessary and inevitable. The 1937 British partition plan, in fact, the Peel Plan, admitted openly the injustice to the Palestinian natives who owned the majority of the land of any partition. And with remarkable disingenuousness, the Peel Commission lauded, celebrated, or cited the proverbial, what they call the generosity of the Arabs to justify what the Peel Commissioner said was at some sacrifice to the Arabs, that this sacrifice would help the Europeans solve what the Commission referred to as the West's, quote, Jewish problem. In other words, the Peel Commissioners were very clear that we see the Palestinians, they're going to suffer, but they're going to help us resolve Europe's Jewish problem. And that is the language of the Peel Commission. A decade later, in November 1947, the Western-dominated UN, of course, this is the UN before decolonization, voted to partition Palestine and to establish a Jewish state, and an Arab one, despite the fact that the same UN recognized that the overwhelming majority of the population of Palestine was Palestinian, and despite centuries of Palestinian belonging to what had always been their lands, their villages, their towns, and their homes. Virtually every Western state that voted for partition in 1947 recognized that the Palestinians, the Arabs, existed and that they would be harmed. But they justified their vote by insisting that what happened to the Jews in Europe was a horror, in other words, the Holocaust, was a horror that needed urgent redress. And this redress, they said, embracing Zionist logic, could only occur in Palestine, even if it occurred at the expense of the Palestinians. In other words, this is not so much about overt denial, but about recognizing the harm that was going to be done to Palestinians and then justifying that harm in the name of making amends for the horrors of the Second World War, and of course for solving what was a European Jewish displaced persons problem after the Second World War. So in the wake of the Holocaust and the creation of a new international community that disavowed the overt racism of Nazi Germany, but turned a blind eye to racism, Western racism, across the rest of the West and, of course, the colonized world, the narrow Christian philo-Semitism that had sort of informed earlier Western support of Zionism was effaced by a far more practical, secular, liberal, and temporally urgent language of saving Jews and ending what was now referred to in 1947 as the Palestine problem. The irony was that the Arab was at last heard at the UN and seen on the ground in Palestine, but without emotion, without identification, without connection, that Jewish diplomats, survivors, and refugees made among Western diplomats. There was nothing the Palestinians or the Arab diplomats at the UN could say, let alone do, that made any appreciable dent in this powerful equivalence between Zionism and the sudden post-war Western desire to be done with its so-called Jewish problem, especially in a manner that satisfied the Zionist movement that claimed to speak on behalf of the Jewish people worldwide. That the Palestinians were to be sacrificed at the altar of philo-Zionism was acknowledged only obliquely, since virtually every Western representative at the UN insisted that they were cognizant and sympathetic to the aspirations of what they referred to as the Arab inhabitants of Palestine. Nevertheless, they voted, almost all of them, for the UNSCOP proposal, the UN Special Committee on Palestine proposal, that of course destroyed Palestine, destroyed Arab society, and as much as they said they were aware of the problems to Palestinians, they nevertheless voted to harm the Palestinians. And then, of course, there was the Nakba of 1948 that at least for a while, brutally resolved the problem of a majority of Palestinian bodies in a Jewish state that had long preoccupied Zionist planners. It created in turn a humanitarian problem that the liberal Western agencies, UNRWA specifically, have only been too happy to tackle so long as it avoided the obvious history and politics of the question of Palestine. Liberal Western states and leaders, in fact, hailed the creation of an ethno-religious nationalist Jewish state in a historically multi-religious land. Leading American liberal figures such as the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr and the co-author of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Eleanor Roosevelt, rationalized and justified the uprooting of Palestinians. So my point here in conclusion is that the Second World War and the creation of Israel in 1948 reflected far more than just Western settler colonialism as a practice of native elimination, although that was obviously there as well. The support for Israel, I think, is the more important point I'm trying to make. The identification with Israel, the reconstitution of post-war Western humanism was reborn with a philo-Zionist core and with a Palestine exception at its heart. In other words, the Western powers after the Second World War claimed to be done with the history of European and Western anti-Semitism by recognizing a Jewish state in Israel, at the same time as they acknowledged initially that there was going to be harm done to the Palestinians. But over time, as Palestinians were made into a refugee people, were made into a stateless people, were made into a people without history, the Palestinians were forgotten. And then what happens is that as they got forgotten and as this narrative of a European triumph in the Second World War over Nazism was consolidated, what happens is that over time, when Palestinians insist on their history, because they're seen as a people without history, they seem to come in from out of the blue as a people without history, and therefore are almost always, and we've heard this over and over again today, depicted as somehow anti-Semitic. And so there we have it until today. That sort of explains to me the kind of the moment that we're in. That no matter what Palestinians say, no matter what they do, until this deeply Eurocentric narrative of one history and only one history that matters is made more universal, until we actually recognize Palestinian history and Palestinian politics, there's very little, I think, to be done to that will break this kind of ideological sort of framework that is so comprehensively excluded Palestinians, expelled Palestinians, as I said, not just from their lands, but from historical consciousness as well in the West, in the mainstream West. Hopefully this is changing with a new generation and with different forms of media, but let's see if that actually happens. Thank you.
I'd like to begin by echoing Usama's thanks to the organizers of the tribunal and the members of Chamber 3, and also I wish I could be there, as I'm sure Usama does with you in Sarajevo. My task is to talk about the culture of denial that has long sustained support for Zionism in the Western world. Across the Western world, we continue to hear some people denying that Israel is transacting a genocide in Gaza. How, we must wonder, can anyone sustain such levels of denial in the face of the first genocide in human history to be live-streamed by its victims and available for any of us to witness in real time on a device held in the palm of our hand? Most of those who engage in this denial are moved by the images and narratives of Israeli suffering on the 7th of October 2023, but have had nothing to say about Palestinian suffering on a far greater scale and for all the months ever since, to which they simply turn a blind eye. For the most part, those who engage in this form of denial are not overt racists necessarily, who explicitly call for the destruction of Gaza and the expulsion of the Palestinians. Of course, there are Israelis who do, like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and Netanyahu, but they say so explicitly. They don't deny what it is that they're doing. They're proud of what it is they're doing. Most of those who engage in denial in the West are ordinary people, solid progressives when it comes to politics, advocates of gender and racial equality, anxious about climate change, concerned for the homeless, voters for the most progressive of politicians. What we are seeing here, then, is not heartlessness, for these people clearly have plenty of heart. It is rather one manifestation of a much broader culture of denial. The reason that people like this seem not to recognize or to see Palestinian suffering is that they really do not see or recognize it. They are far too intent, far too focused on the suffering of people with whom they can much more readily identify, people that they understand to be just like themselves. A scene of suffering that, with all the logic of a monopoly, occludes, overshadows, displaces, removes from view, hides any other kind of suffering with which it might otherwise be seen to compete. And if anyone brings that occluded suffering into view, their reaction will be one of anger. Why, they will say, are you telling me to look at that instead of joining me in my outrage about this? Can you not see this? Don't look over there. Look over here with me. Such forms of occlusion are features of a much more widespread culture of denial that for decades enabled otherwise progressive and even left-wing people in the West to support the Zionist project in Palestine while remaining in denial about what it is they're actually supporting. How, after all, could a left-leaning Western person reconcile a commitment to democracy and human rights with their support for a state that practices apartheid? How could one balance one's support for the separation of church and state, one of the core Western values, with one's support for a state in which the lack of such a distinction is a founding premise? One's belief in civil marriage and women's rights with a state that has no institution of civil marriage and imposes ancient theocratic restrictions on the rights of married, at least Jewish women. One's affirmation of a culture of inclusion with a political system premised on brute exclusion. These contradictions are not mere hypocrisy, any more than the people who mourn the loss of Israeli life but turn a blind eye to the loss of Palestinian life are hypocritical. Hypocrisy, after all, involves a kind of self-knowledge, and what we see here is a form of denial, not awareness. But simply ignoring and looking aside, refusing to recognize, these are difficult to sustain on their own, especially in the face of a massive archive of evidence to the contrary, and they provide no basis for the elaboration of a progressive sense of self. Something more is needed to enable such a subject to reconcile her support for Zionism with her commitment to progressive values. Essential to this miraculous act of political alchemy, as I argue in my book, Tolerance is a Wasteland, is a very specific form of denial, in which the Palestinian claim to Palestine is not simply refused, covered up, or negated. Rather, it is occluded by being expressed as an affirmation of various positive virtues that can fervently be embraced. The emphasis of the positive value doesn't just make it possible to overlook the dark history. It makes the dark history possible in the first place. It nourishes and sustains it. I want to give at least one brief example to ground this argument, which otherwise risks sounding abstract. After the Zionist gangs and militias that would eventually coalesce into the Israeli army completed their expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from Palestine during the Nakba of 1948, the terrain left behind was a landscape of empty ruin. The first step in remaking this landscape in the image of the new putatively Jewish state was the demolition of Palestinian homes, mosques, churches, and cemeteries, as well as the methodical extirpation of the cultivated landscape of citrus and olive groves and prickly pear cactuses, the indigenous landscape to which those homes and other spaces had once corresponded. No sooner had Palestinian villages been demolished than the agencies and auxiliaries of the new state, in particular the Jewish National Fund, started planting forests over their ruins. Unlike the demolition of family homes, which was done as quietly as possible, the project of tree planting over the ruins of these now unmentioned, disappeared, erased from all maps villages was, and still is, carried out with much fanfare and under the banner of grand proclamations. People, particularly Jewish people, are invited to plant a tree in Israel, to donate funds for afforestation, to make the desert bloom, and to visit ceremonial tree planting sites where they can actively participate in this quite literally wonderful endeavor. As though by magic, then, a project of ethnic cleansing has been transformed into one of family-centered tree planting, and by virtue of that transformation, it has secured the support it needs from progressive subjects who would never knowingly lend their support to a process of mass eviction and home demolition, but do lend their support as long as it is disavowed and almost literally unknown, turn into something positive and affirmative, such as greening the landscape, making the desert bloom, and so on. The deliberate and systematically worked through occlusion of the Palestinian claim to the land has thus itself been occluded by a transformative act of affirmation to which hyperbolic levels of acclaim and attention can be drawn. Don't look over there at the ruins of Palestinian villages. Look over here with me at the wonderful forest making the desert bloom. There are other versions of this story that I could tell, other examples, but for the sake of time, I'll skip them. What I want to come back to now is the face of the forms of denial that we see transacted again in among Western liberals. There are still some of them who support who support the Zionist project in Palestine, and they obviously have to engage in order to reconcile their support for Zionism. They have to engage in a form of denial about what it is that's actually happening, not just in Gaza but throughout Palestine. Those who engage in this form of denial about the genocide that Israel is transacting in Gaza are involved in a very similar form of denial to the one I just outlined. What we're witnessing in this case, the Gaza case, is a return to the same mechanisms of denial and occlusion discussed earlier, only turned on their head. Instead of transacting denial by loudly drawing attention to a positive value, this time denial is transacted by loudly drawing attention to a negative. The structure itself remains intact, but just flipped around. Still, don't look over there, join me in looking over here instead. That is the function of the persistent narratives around the events of October 7, 2023, and how they are relentlessly presented to Western audiences. Hence, for example, the film consisting of brutal video footage from that day, curated and packaged by the Israeli army and exhibited in Western sites of image and narrative production, including New York and above all here in Los Angeles and Hollywood. The function of this film in the context of the ongoing genocide in Gaza is to draw attention away from Gaza and help to justify the genocide. A similar role is played by the quasi-documentary featuring and supported by Sheryl Sandberg, alleging that Hamas conducted a mass rape campaign on October 7th, for which, of course, there remains no tangible evidence, and as we know, the Israeli state continues to block international investigations of that day's events. That is also the function of the Traveling Nova exhibition that claims, again, in places like New York and here in LA, it was here too, that claims to replicate the attack on that festival. It is also the function of the recent BBC documentary on October 7th. It is the function of the October 7th narrative play, which was staged in New York, Los Angeles, including on my campus and elsewhere. And Israel is producing a vast walkthrough reconstruction of what it claims is the October 7th experience, a scripted space to re-traumatize anyone who wasn't already traumatized on that day, to capture the trauma specifically in order to reify and to package it. All of these products are intended to fixate people's attention on October 7th precisely to the exclusion, and this is the point, of everything that came before and everything that's continued ever since October 7th. Again, the structure is, don't look over there at this Holocaust taking place before our eyes. Look over here with me at this alternative scene that I want you to focus on, and that, of course, that I'm intent on focusing on. Those not actually interpolated into these structures of denial in person, for them, the main way this structure of denial works is by this constant return to and recycling of a certain narrative of October 7th. This is the whole purpose of the constant return to and recycling of October 7th that continues to saturate the news space all around us in the form of restatements that are there in literally every single mainstream press report that is even remotely connected to Gaza. This violence, we are told over and over and over again, began as though out of the blue when Hamas attacked Israel, to use the scripted line, on October 7th and killed 1,200 civilians. It is arguably even more in this constant restatement of a particular framing of the events of October 7th and their context, or rather lack of context, than in the distorted coverage of the news coming out of Gaza itself, that our mainstream news organizations have made themselves the enablers of this genocide. The constant return to and recycling of October 7th helps to sustain the genocide by occluding it. The version of October 7th, moreover, to which our attention and sympathy are constantly being drawn, has been frozen. It's been frozen in the sense that it is premised on a forestalling and denial of all of the specific knowledge of that day that has emerged in the months since it took place, to which the Western mainstream media have been entirely impermeable, even though these news stories have been circulating all over the mainstream press in Israel itself, in English, as well as in Hebrew, and of course in alternative media throughout the world. These stories yield a far more complicated set of scenarios than the simplistic narrative of Palestinian animal savagery unleashed against Israeli bridal innocence, to which our attention is unceasingly drawn. We now know, for example, that an as yet undetermined number, but clearly a significant proportion of the civilians killed that day were in fact killed by the Israeli army's activation of its Hannibal Directive and its subsequent indiscriminate bombardment of built-up areas and anybody or anything moving to or from Gaza. We now know, because the broadcasts of them saying so in their own words appeared literally within days of October 7th, that Israeli helicopter gunship pilots and tank crews fired missiles and high-explosive 30mm and 120mm shells at buildings inside Israel, and again, anything moving to or from Gaza without positive identification. In other words, without actually having any idea what or whom they were firing at, whether they are Palestinian or Israeli, fighters or civilians. Although stories about the activation of the Hannibal Directive on October 7th started, as I said, appearing in Israeli media within days of that event, their first appearance in a mainstream Western news outlet occurred almost a full year later via a story carried on the national ABC News in Australia in September 2024. The story has received no other coverage to my awareness in mainstream media in the US to this very day. Moreover, this version of October 7th has been frozen in the sense that it has been lifted altogether out of history, as though nothing had happened before it to make it possible, as those 75 years of abrogated rights, the detention of tens of thousands of men, women, and children at a time, the closures and lockdowns, the checkpoints and home raids, the ethnic cleansing, home demolition, child abduction, random bombardment, dispossession, torture, rape, murder, abuse, immobilization, deprivation, punishment, siege, had all never happened. And as though nothing has happened since, as though October 7th is the only day in history. This suspension at time thus transacts two structures of denial simultaneously. In insistently and naggingly drawing attention to this one day, it occludes all the days that came before. It blots them out, it hides them from view, it thus decontextualizes the events of that one day, making them impossible to historicize and therefore to understand. And at the same time, it hides from view all the days that have followed ever since, and hence it helps to justify the genocide that has been unfolding for every month, week, day, hour, minute, and second ever since. Stopping one clock on October 7th is exactly what makes the other clock, the clock of genocide, run. This is the meaning of denial in a time of genocide. Thank you.